Former director and professor at National School of Drama and a theatre scholar, Kirti Jain has directed several plays, conducted theatre workshops, has edited a book on Badal Sarkar, and contributed articles to books and journals. She has also produced plays and documentaries for Doordarshan and is trustee of Natrang Pratishthan, a theatre resource center. During her tenure as director NSD, she started the Theatre in Education Company, the Documentation and Publication Programs, the Regional Research Center for National School of Drama, and initiated a change in curriculum. Her recent directorial work includes Aur Kitne Tukde, based on partition, Kaun Thagwa Nagariya Lutal Ho, about globalization, Baghdad Burning, a comment on the US invasion on Iraq, and Hamara Sheher Us Baras by Gitanjali Shri. A recipient of several awards and felicitations, she was honored with the B.V. Karan Smriti Puraskar in 2010 and Sangeet Natak Academy Award for Direction in 2011. We welcome you, ma'am. Dr. Arno Bohler teaches at the University of Vienna Department of Philosophy and at the University of Applied Arts, Vienna. He is the founder of the Philosophy Performance Festival, Philosophy on Stage, and directs the residency program for arts-based philosophy and artistic research in South India, the BASE Collective. Together with Suzanne Valerie Granzer, he has developed a new cross-disciplinary strategy between philosophy and the arts to give back to philosophy in materiality, corporeality, sensibility, and vulnerability. In this context, Bohler was principal investigator of 3 research projects funded by the Austrian Science Funds: Artist Philosophers, Philosophy as Arts-Based Research, Generating Bodies, and Materiality and Temporality of Performative Speech Arts. Bohler was a visiting research fellow at the University of Bangalore, the University of Heidelberg, New York University, University of Princeton, and a visiting professor at the University of Applied Arts, Vienna, Department of Philosophy. We welcome you, sir. Arnika Ahldag is a PhD candidate at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. In her research, she is looking at the representation of labor in Indian art through the depiction of laboring bodies, through activist engagement with and advocacy for workers' unions or groups, or through collaborations with them in the making of artworks or projects. Based in New Delhi, she has been making work as a solo artist and in collaboration with Amitesh Grover. Recent projects include City as Demo as a part of the Bhubaneswar Art Trade 2018, Back to Work 2016-17 as a part of the exhibition Hunger for the Passerby, curated by Akanksha Rastogi, KNMA, Notes on Mourning, Mourning as Practice 2015, Downtime, Sleep as Performance 2014. These projects reflect work as performance and inquire into changing notions of profession and labor, the transactional value of work, situational implementations of work, and the new emerging figure of the worker. She also works with the Mobile Academy Berlin, a group of artists, researchers, and academics from various fields, media, literature, philosophy, working between the intersection of art and science and on different modes of knowledge distribution. A warm welcome to you, ma'am. Samuel Berthet is born in Grenoble, France in 1975. In his experimental school, he engaged with theatre and other performing arts at a very early age. After a gap, he resumed during high school under various formats and started directing in college. After college, India became his stage. A historian, he teaches now at Shiv Nadar University. A warm welcome to you, sir. I request the Senior Faculty of National School of Drama, Associate Professor of Acting, Ms. Hema Singhji, to kindly come onto the stage and felicitate the chair and the panelists for the session.
Very warm welcome to everyone. Let me Kirti ma'am, it's very heavy, but can I keep it up with the please? Oh God. It's like the dates.
Thank you.
Yeah, please. Yes, welcome. I think Abhilash should give one to me also. Yes, it's like wait.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
we're all very eager to listen to what each one of you has to put forth today. I request Professor Kirti Jain to kindly begin the session. Ma'am, you have the days.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't think I'll take any more time because we're already starting about 20 minutes late. So the order of speakers would be, let me tell you now, would be Arno, Bohler, then Arnika, and then Samuel. And if we can keep to our 20 minutes, that will be very helpful. So let's begin. Thanks.
Good. Since we are used to speak very long at the university, so I will cross-check here that I'm not speaking too long. Yes, and I stop to control me. So first, I also really would like to thank NSD for the invitation and also this wonderful hospitality. For me, I'm very often in India, but every time again, it's beautiful to be here and to experience this hospitality. Probably I will teach Europe once what it means to be hospitable. So today, since I was invited to speak about visual languages, I had the idea that I would like to introduce you. Thank you. Do you hear me now better? Yes. Yes. So I had the idea that I would like to introduce you the influence a little bit of fine arts into contemporary performance and theater practices in Europe, because the fine arts became very important. So they are not just doing stage design or designing the room, but they took over a very important role in many art groups in Europe. And so I thought I would like to speak first a little bit about fine artists I am working with since many years, because we are both having attempts to artistic research, what we in Europe call the artistic research. So that's a kind of hybrid form of bringing the arts together in a dialogue with the sciences and philosophy, but not only like we do it here, that probably there are performances going on and now we are talking about things, but really to bring the artists, philosophers, scientists together on stage and develop together performances. So this is my understanding of a transdisciplinary approach toward a new way of performing in the arts and creating a new visual language. So what you see here now, is this now changing or? Yes, could you probably make that it goes through the whole thing? What you see here now, this was on March 14 to 17 last year. There was a first academy of the Society for Artistic Research in Barcelona in Spain. So usually they have a conference where people do perform, but this was a first academy. And then they were thinking of how can they bring in an artistic way even of doing a conference on artistic research. So they were inviting a fine artist. I told you already, you see him on the right side, Nicolas Ganstra. He's making diagrams. He calls these trans lectures and diagrams. On the left side, you see Emma Cocker. She's from the United Kingdom, and she calls herself an artist writer. And so they were both invited to this conference, but respond to the conference with their own artistic means. Yeah? So that they were not just writing a protocol about what happened or what was said in the conference, but they tried to, as Emma Cocker says, she tries to make field notes. That means she tried to translate during the conference what was said in her own way of artistic writing. And Nicholas Ganstra was trying to translecture, what he calls translecture. He tried to find a new way of expressing, not as you have it usually in scientific diagrams, where you have all these straight lines, yeah, and all these numbers, where everything seems very clear and you can differentiate easily. So there is India and there is Europe, and you have a clear number and you have clear lines. But once an artist, a painter, is trying to sensitively make his drawings on what he heard and which discussions were going on, suddenly you have a very other visuals as we are usually used to have in the science field. You all know the diagram. So he calls this translecture, and he tries to show that in art there are very other figures showing up, as you see here, as those which we are used usually in protocoling and saying what factually took place. This does not, they say, factually took place, but it's already an imaginary artistic response, and tries, as I will show then in my short talk, that what he calls with another painter, probably you know him or you have seen pictures of him, the famous painter Francis Bacon. He was painting, he's very, one of the most important painters in the 20th century in Europe, and he was going back to figurative painting. So you can famous in his are his drawings, for example, of images of the Pope, but the figures which you see in Bacon's will be deformed. So you see a face, but the face will be very deformed, because according to Bacon, what is really going on in visual arts is not that even if you paint a mountain, or even if you paint people who are sitting now in this room, it is, as he famously defined it, it is about capturing forces which are in the space. So it is, even if he would draw a cow, it would be much more of that he tries to sense what is more in the space and not only in the body of the cow. Yeah? And this is the same what they said here. It is about an art of touching and being in touch with a space in different mediums like poetry or like drawing. So for me, this is very important. And then also what we heard, if you were here in the last sections, he spoke about choreographic figures. And I was silently smiling a little bit, because this is the title exactly of what Nicholas Ganstra is calling his project. It's about choreographic figures. And choreo, we heard already in the session before, means in antique Greek something like being together, being a chorus. So it's not about one body, but it is about the body being in touch with other bodies. So a chorus is not one single body, but it is one single body, as Susanne also said it, experiencing himself or herself in the middle of the space in which that body shares with other bodies. So for example, if I have, and now I become a little bit philosophical, which is also one important thing for this kind of performance, what we are doing and Ganstra is doing, so that we are usually saying that when I feel something, this feeling is private. And I think this is the opposite here of what you see. Because he does really try to feel and capture the forces which were going on in the conference. So for sure, in order to be capable of doing this, he needs a lot of skills of how to draw things. Yeah? He has to be educated in these things. But at the end, what you see there is really a picture, a diagram, as he would call it, of what took place in the conference. So it's all about being in touch with the space, being sensual, sensing what is in the air, Emma Cocker calls it. But on the other side, it is not about subjectivity. So I think this is a big misunderstanding that I always say critically and polemically that the privatization has not only going on in companies, and in the economical field, but the privatization has been going on in the way that we are called that feelings are private. And I don't think, as a philosopher who tries to fight against cliches of thinking, Wittgenstein has really a beautiful sentence. He says, what is philosophy? And he says, it is a way to get rid of the cliches which capture your head. So it is physical, it is bodily, even philosophy, in my understanding, because in philosophy I'm not just fighting against some ideas, I am fighting against the cliches and the prejudgments which are in my head. And if you read Plato, it is said, when you look, Plato, he has a beautiful beginning. If you look into the heaven, then you see the ideas. And it's very nice that the head is no more part of the body, but it looks out of the body and simply watching the ideas. But I can touch it. For me, the head is still a part of my physical body. And if I want, as a philosopher, try to free myself from cliches and stereotypes which has been imprinted in my head, I am doing body work. This is something, but I'm not just in the opposite of the mental sphere, which would not be physical. In Indian philosophy, it's very beautiful because they know something like there are bodies which are very subtle. So you cannot see them, but they are not ideal in the Platonic sense, European sense, but they are real in a very sensible way or fine way of matter. So what I think about a new visual language of art is that it has to do a lot with touch, with being in touch with others. And I think, as I said, even if we feel something, it is clear that I am feeling it because my body has been affected and triggered by certain impulses which are in the room. But even if I feel it, what I feel is my relation to the others in the room. It is not just privatized subjectivity, but it is really a lot about feeling what is really going on here and now, for example, in this conference. So even if it's my feeling, it has a so-called objective side feeling, because feeling, as we in philosophy would say, has still the structure of intentionality. It is feeling about something. And in the feeling about something, you are out there in the object which you feel. So if I fall in love, I feel it. But in love, I feel you. Yeah? It's not about privatization. It's not about my subjectivity in which I feel. Even Kant, as a philosopher, still used affect as the way of being außer sich. So in German it is being outside, in touch with the others. So what I would say, what here you see, this is not objective art, but it is much more drawings and poetries and reflections of how in that situation of the conference you were in touch with that conference. So that is one thing which I would say is a very important notion of choreographic figures. So the second part then, I would say, is when we try to think this as a very bodily way of sensing, we have to get a new impression of what the body is. So Bacon in his drawing said that it is very important that he tries, when he paints in his visual art, it is not about a figure, but it is about a triad of a figure, a sensation, and the forces which are in the space he tries to draw. So it's not about one thing, but it is really how a body is affected in a certain way. It is a lot about how the body is related to its own environment. And therefore, for me, it is very important that this is a way of thinking the body from an environmental perspective. Yeah? If you are in a performance, it is not about your body, but it is about your way of being in touch with the audience, being in touch during a performance. Yeah? That is the other thing. So what I would say, if we really try to have a new language of visual arts, it is also that we have to deconstruct our prejudgments of what a body is, and that a body is not only figurative in the way that it ends at the end of his skin, but on the other side, bodies are skin-like. I think the artist's body is skin, like Jean-Luc says so beautifully. It is never ending here at the surface of my body, but it really is the body becoming skin and becoming skin-like. So that is the one thing what I think is going on here. The second thing, because I was asked also to speak about the perspective of the audience and the spectators. The same thing for me is true from the spectator's perspective of the audience. Because if you once see the audience not so much as being a body sitting there in the chairs, yeah, and looking to the performance, but seeing a body that is sensing primarily, yeah, that is sensing what is going on in that space, then you can never think anymore of the audience as being a kind of mirror or a kind of objective observer. Because what you have there in the audience, there are also bodies sitting with their own multiple perspective, with their own interests, with their own way of trying to make a living in the very basic sense of maintaining themselves into being. So I think what is no more going on in this kind of aesthetics is that we think in any way, either in the sciences nor in the theater, that the spectator's view would be something which is looking to the performance from a bird-eyes view. That is simply no more working, because they are never looking from a bird-eyes view, but they bring in their body with the whole sensuality, which is a constitutive part of this body. And therefore, I would say that is for me one of the most beautiful things of choreographic figures, that in this way, the audience is like a sensual chorus sitting there in the stage, trying to be in touch what is going on the stage, and therefore, even if they just watch, and even if they just listen, and even if they just sit, they are involved and engaged in what is going on. So it would be absurd to think that they are sitting there and trying to get an objective view of what is going on in the theater. What is the beauty is that it is, the theater for me is exactly no more, to take a Foucaultian term, a panopticon. We had it also in the choreographic talk which he was alluding for. So what is the beauty is that there is no central point, there is no monarchic point anymore going on, because there are so many eyes looking, there are so many eyes listening. And therefore, what is beautiful about the spectator's perspective, that it is choreo, and in that way, as he said, it is in itself democratic. Yeah? It is absurd to say there is one telling you, as he criticized, like often the director, yeah, what is going on in the theater. Because the beauty is that once it's about sensible bodies that are gathering in the audience and on stage, then it's all about sharing perspective. And the more eyes and the more ears are listening and watching, the more objective we are in what is taking place. So there is no uniforming horizon that is bringing them together from a meta-acting, but the beautiful is that through the complexities of the eyes, looking, sensing, watching, you create something like a Picasso picture of what is going on. That you have no one picture, but you see it from the many eyes, and this is why I like many Indian symbolics, yeah, the Shiva with many eyes, yeah, he has together, because that is for me a nice symbol in a certain way of what is going on in a performance, and especially also from the perspective. It's all about sharing, and it's all about sharing a multitude of perspectives. And therefore, I would like to conclude or question, could there be a democracy, a choreos, a choreography in the broader social sense of the term without theater? Because theater does not only, it can, but it does not necessarily have to be political in the sense that it speaks about politics. It is political in the choreographic sense always, because it's about sharing a multitude of perspectives in one room from the spectators, but also from the actor's side. And therefore, we should not even for sure use this distinction anymore, because even if you are listening, you are not a passive spectator, but you are engaging in what you hear. And in that way, bringing back the old meaning of the word ecstatic in Greek philosophy, ecstatic just means in the Greek terminology, you are able to come outside of yourself. Yeah? And I think that is the nice thing if that happens in a performance, that in a certain way you are getting rid of your daily concerns in the way of what you see enables you suddenly to share a perspective with others outside, in a certain way, of your daily concerns. And therefore I would say, I would give an ad, there cannot be a democratic culture without performing arts.
Thanks. Thanks, Arno. A very important formulation in today's time about democracy. I request Arnika to.
was quite daunting to have to speak right after a philosopher. I try my best though, and we may even connect in some ways, because I think how you were talking about introducing science into theater practice and different bodies of it. So, thank you very much for the invitation to NSD, and I must say when Abhilash called and invited me to talk on this panel about new visual language in theater, I was a little bit confused because I'm actually not from a theater background. I'm from the visual arts. And at the same time, I got quite excited because whenever I had the chance in the past to work with the Mobile Academy and I could step into the world of theater at least for a brief moment, I felt that there was a sense of family, and which is something that is not there in the visual arts, and I always enjoyed that a lot, so I'm quite happy to be here. I will be talking about two projects by the Mobile Academy Berlin. One project that I was actively working on as a researcher and in production, and another project that talks more from the perspective of the spectator, that I will show visuals of and explain to you what I saw. And I hope that this way of presenting how we work within the Mobile Academy to what you get to see will make sense to you and kind of respond to the new visual languages. So I briefly introduced the Mobile Academy to people who don't know about them. They're based in Berlin, but they operate all over the world. The Mobile Academy is run by Hannah Hurzig since 1999 already, and it's a company comprising of a group of artists, researchers, and academics. And since its foundation, the Mobile Academy has staged scenes, settings, and architecture of knowledge distribution and dissemination and performative installations on the rhetoric of the dialogue and the art of conversation. Their most successful format is the black market of useful knowledge and non-knowledge, which I won't be talking about. But they most often interweave in their events academic or scientific knowledge with fiction, stories, and images. And the topics branch into various stories via different media. And since 2010, the Mobile Academy has worked on different topics of life science, examining the precarious zones between life and death, and investigating the milieu of the dead, or more precisely, trying to improve the milieu of the dead, which I think is quite interesting also here, because even in the earlier panel we heard a lot about worlds, different worlds, the world of children, the world of theater, and the crossing of certain worlds. So I may be speaking about crossing the worlds of the living and the dead. So the first project I'm talking about actually happened in Delhi in 2014. And it was called Last Minute Exercise. And it was on invitation by Rax Media Collective, who had curated the exhibition Insert. And it happened at IGNCA. It actually happened on the 14th of February, I think. And while we were planning this, we were asked to do it in the amphitheater of the IGNCA, and we got quite excited. We had a wonderful German architect who did the entire stage design with a very complicated table setup that reached from the people tree into the audience, and it was quite amazing. And we kept asking people, like, is it going to rain in February? And people were telling us, nah, it doesn't really rain in February. And now every year, mid-February, I hear these rain showers again, and I remember how exactly just before the event in the night, there was horrible rain, and we had to take the entire setup and bring it inside the auditorium of the IGNCA, which is not a very interesting space, but nevertheless. So our interest was, I think, came from a question of how do we think about death in the West, and what do we do if death occurs? And in the West, there isn't much to hold on to. People don't talk about it as much. There are no rituals or hardly any. It's something you want to just get over with. And then, of course, being here, you witness all these different rituals, and you witness different religions engaging with it differently. So what we did is we start always with one question. And the question was, when is one actually dead? And from there we came up with more questions. I'll read out a few of those. Does death connote finality or transition? Is the moment of death a moment of disintegration into elemental nature or dissolution into the cosmos? Does it occur when a person stops breathing or when their funeral rites are concluded? Is it a marker of the marvelous contingency and brevity of human life, or a prelude into an embrace of the infinite? Is death the occasion for a judgment on the conduct of how a life was lived? Is it the great tidying up of the mess of all our days, the instrument that established the order of the world? Is it death that ensures the individual is absorbed into the collective presence of memory or rendered absent into oblivion? Does death renew life by making room for the living? So we always come from a point of not knowing. We assume, we acknowledge that we don't know much. But gladly, there are a lot of people who have worked on these things extensively. And our first step is then to research these people and to find these people in one city from very different fields. So for last minute exercise, just to name a few, we had Dr. Nandi from the Sir Gangaram Hospital, who was part of the committee that established the brain death criteria in India. There was Amitesh Grover, who spoke about death on stage. There was a nurse who had accompanied people over and over again in the process of dying. And we then meet these people, and we talk to them, and we find an interesting narration. We don't rehearse, so usually it's just one meeting, maybe for an hour, maybe two, and we find out what they could be talking about. And then we invite them for this day, and as you can see in the photo, there's a booking counter. So when you come, there's an audience. You can decide whether you want to sit in the audience with headphones and listen to the different conversations, or if you actively want to take part and become a client. So you would ask to meet the expert on stage and either listen to the narration, interrupt the person, ask questions, be prepared with questions. That's totally up to you. I show you some pictures. So that's the booking, so that's the counter where you then receive your headphones. And this is what it looks like. So this should have happened in the amphitheater, and it would have looked much nicer. But nevertheless, it's interesting when you enter that space. You know, when you're sitting in the audience, and for a brief moment you take off your headphones, and you notice that it's very silent. You just hear people like moving their feet on the ground a little bit. Usually nobody talks. I think for the speaker, it's also an interesting experience because the speakers can't know which conversation the audience is listening in. So there are 3 different channels. And the audience, they might all be listening to couple number 1, expert and client, because they are popular or more interesting or whatever. And the only way to find out is actually if you crack a joke, because then you get to know who in the audience laughs. All of these conversations then are recorded, and they feed into an online archive. And I think by now this online archive must be having about 2,000 talks. And it's a bit like a podcast. A lot of people use it as a source for research or just enjoying listening to these conversations. There was another exercise where you could meet either the filmmaker Q from Kolkata or Inda Salim, the performance artist, and they would explore with you the idea of what you wish your eternity, your afterlife to be. And this was away from the audience. People could not see them talking. It was in a small private space, but people could listen to it still, but they wouldn't know who's the person who's talking in there. The second project I will be talking about is the Immobilized, or Salle de Passepartout, which happened in Hamburg in 2017. And it was part of the, I think, Kampnagel Theater Festival, something. And I happened to be in Hamburg to deliver a talk on something else, so I was lucky enough to see the work. I had heard a lot about the work because I'm always in touch with the Mobile Academy, and I read the proposal and so on. So there was a little bit of knowledge what to expect, but not more than that. So just to give you a bit of a background, this was 2017 in Europe, in Germany, which was the peak of the refugee crisis. And we happen to think a lot about the sea as a place of the living and the dead, and how the sea is changing as a space, and how it becomes a place of transition eventually. And wondering who belongs to that space and who does this space belong to. And I'm going to read out a little bit because, I mean, they've written it quite beautifully and I couldn't tell it in the same way. And this was basically the information you would have before entering the space. It all begins with the scene of an overloaded boat on the Mediterranean. The passengers stand motionless for the whole of the crossing. The bodies pressed together form a piece of solid cargo. Too much movement would capsize the boat. This image stands at the beginning of a story of the immobilized. It tells of people turned into cargo on slave ships, of the time stilled of the goods on a long journey, of human pupae cryoconserved in nitrogen tanks, awaiting their artificial resurrection. And it tells of the absence of the dead amongst the living. There's a lot of talk about the dead today, and even more about the dying. But the dead and the ancestors don't wander about. They need a special milieu to be able to be present, absent, as it's their way. They find it in the waiting room of lost steps. The images and stories of the past and the future converge here. The former them, the living, meet the future us, the dead, and other immobilized. The catastrophe has already happened. Now everyone is romping around in the transit space of history. Brisk radio communication is going on here. In the waiting room of lost steps, one can follow the communication on 5 radio channels in a walk-in and strictly synchronized performative installation. So you reached that venue and you bought your ticket and you got headphones and you were told that there are 5 channels in English and German. And then you would enter the space, and I'll show you a little film. I'm going to play the first 2 minutes with the sound, then go on silent and keep talking. So that's what you see when you enter.
Willkommen im Wartesaal der verlorenen Schritte. Hier herrscht reger Funkverkehr. Auf 5 Kanälen können Sie sich den verschiedenen Stationen zuschalten. Aber unsere Zeit ist begrenzt. Heute Abend haben wir die üblichen 90 Minuten. Werden wir genug Zeit gehabt haben? Es gibt einen Hype, der die Lust am Stillstand feiert und die Zeit einfriert. Menschen eingefroren in Alltagsbewegung. Alle stehen ganz still, einer filmt. Das ist die Mannequin Challenge. Übersetzt Schaufensterpuppen-Herausforderung. Auf einem überladenen Boot auf dem Mittelmeer Richtung Europa Müssen viele einzelne Körper eng aneinander gepresst zu einem kompakten Block Fracht werden. Die Geflüchteten müssen stillstehen für Tage. Bewegen sie sich unkoordiniert, kentert das Boot. Wenn einer über Bord fällt, wohin sinkt er? Vielleicht durchquert der Ertrinkende in seinem Sinkflug in unzugängliche Tiefen das aquautopische Gebiet der Waterbabys. Aber am Ende landet er auf nationalem Territorium. Der Meeresboden wird seit 2002 unter den Staaten aufgeteilt. Es ist die größte Landverteilung der Geschichte der Menschheit und sie findet genau in diesem Moment statt. Versteckt, anonym, ohne demokratische Kontrolle.
So for me, that was the first moment where I got a little confused, where I was thinking this committee that is allocating the continental shelf, does that really exist or is that fiction? I mean, we should be knowing about this, right? If the land under the sea is being given out to countries anew, and then if people die on sea, on which country's ground do they actually die? And then you move through the whole installation, always with your headphones on. And this, for example, is a space where there are always people in conversation from very different fields. And they have a kind of tarot system. So there are printed cards on the table that have eventually ideas, questions, or theories. And these people are talking. So here it's a theorist, Christina Sharp, and two investigative journalists. And sometimes you feel they are in dialogue, but sometimes the dialogue can't happen because the language just doesn't match. It doesn't work. People come from two different worlds to even meet. And then it's a retelling of things, and the other person is eventually listening. But you wonder where this knowledge transfer in this moment is happening, but it may be happening with you because you're sitting there and you may sympathize with one of the speakers on either sides. This was a DJ booth. So there was, in the mid-90s, I think there was a techno duo in Chicago, and they dealt with the story of the water babies. Water babies are thought to be the children of pregnant slave women who had been thrown overboard and who had found the ability to talk underwater. And dyslexia, this DJ duo, had found, were telling stories through techno music. And you could listen to that. This was a morgue in which the TV company Drop Dead Gorgeous was looking for actors for dead bodies. And they were receiving their makeup right there to eventually act in a TV series that was looking at the murder of NGO workers in Namibia. And Susanne Sachse, an actress from the Volksbühne, and Vaginal Davis, the two of them were going through the different people and were taking decisions who's going to be on that TV show and who not. And then I think, which we will be seeing now, you turn towards the heart piece of the entire installation, which was like a large mechanic spiral stage, which had a curtain that would kind of create moments of inclusion and exclusion between the audience and the people who were talking. And it was called the arena, the milieu of the dead, in which were people suggesting a research proposal to a committee on how to improve and how to research the milieu of the dead. And this was translated into either English or German, depending on the language the speakers were talking about. And the speakers are from media theory, art history, and I think law, while the committee was 2 philosophers giving their feedback straight away. And then you can again see that the audience was sitting with headphones on in the space, which was then on and off divided by this curtain. So, this is the setup again, and a couple of pictures. I would like to return to this quote that I was already showing in the beginning. And I think that's for me what the work of the Mobile Academy is about. That it's creating a structure for narrating, for fabulating, for hallucinating, and to blur the lines between fiction and fact. Thank you.
Thank you. I think 2 very different presentations about research, the linkages between research and theatre. This was very fascinating, that how when we talk of theatre being collaborative, theatre being multidisciplinary, these are kind of new boundaries in the multidisciplinary sphere that are being explored. And what also struck me was that while he talked about how there is a togetherness in the audience when we are viewing theatre, when we were watching these, the headphones are creating the isolation. You know, the audience is not really together. So how different experiences would mean different things to the viewer. Thank you so much, Arnika. Samuel.
Thank you, Professor Jain, and thank you to the NSD for this invitation. I think we are, the title of the session is to talk about new visual language from the perspective of the spectator. I don't know if I will really enlighten you after those two thoughtful and very deep talks. My relation to theater is extremely ambiguous, ambivalent, and conflictive. Because I almost started doing theater not as soon as I was born, but as soon as I went to school, then stopped for some time and resumed in high school and in university in a very intense manner, and directing plays. And then, as I said in my synopsis, I came to India. Arnika said theater has something of a family. I joined a group, but of course, as you said, family is not always extremely, it can be something, a very nice feeling, and it can be sometimes also, being in a family, a bit oppressive. And finally, India became that stage, or South Asia, because I was in Bangladesh for 5 years. Now, when I received the subject, new visual language, I was kind of a bit skeptical in the sense, I always have that quote by Gregory Bateson, regarding a dancer performance, and after the dance show, someone comes to the dancer and asks her, "So what exactly did you want to mean through that performance?" And she answered, "Well, if I could put it in words, I would have written a book and not dance it." So I'm always a little bit, how to say, uncomfortable with the very idea of visual language when it comes to theater. Again, Gregory Bateson had that idea that at the end of the day, verbal language is only 20% of the expression of the whole message. And here I'm talking about message and not information. I'll come back to that. And I also come back a bit to what Arno said, a very interesting question about the chorus and democracy. So I have a very broad first approach about the idea of inner and outer space and the state. So we'll bring back a bit of very basic politics into it. The body as a site of inscription, rather than language maybe, and the resistance to information. We've seen that this question of information, new technologies lingering around. And since I do still perform in a way with my teaching in Shivnada University and elsewhere before, and I always try to pay attention a lot to my students, to my audience, and that raised in me a lot of concern, and I started actually also a new course on social media and artificial intelligence, and I'll maybe get some inputs from this experience. So I'll just start with another quote by Roger Chartier, who said that the object of cultural history is the study of paradoxical intersection between outflank constraints and curb liberties. That's not a very nice translation of croisement paradoxal entre contraintes débordées et liberté bridée. It means we try always to negotiate between those constraints which are there, which we try, of course, to overcome, and those liberties, this freedom, which we maybe do not manage to totally leash out. The very, very broad perspective, why am I coming back to the mode of consumption of theater, is that in France, the first, you are actually allowed to work when you are 16 years old. So I was doing theater all the time, apart from my studies. And the first time I got a salary, I bought myself 1 year subscription for the Théâtre Municipal, the theater in my city, to see all the programs. And I was extremely excited. There were big names performing. Well, I was very happy to see some Peter Brook and so many other great artists. And yet I felt that, wow, it seemed like it was a place where people would go, affluent people, mainly because it looked, well, quite chic to go to theater. And I was often a bit surprised that, let's say, after L'homme qui prenait sa femme pour un chapeau by Peter Brook, a play where the actors do play the doctors and the psychiatric patients, and you don't really see the change occurring. It's pretty a powerful play, which left a very deep impression on me. And just after the play stopped, I started listening to conversation around, wow, how did you like the play? Well, quite good. Oh, the shoes I saw in the shop just before coming in, so great. I thought maybe I should go back to the shop and buy it. And I was like, wow, okay, they are really here just because, well, they have to do something which look nice according to their social status. Some shows also of singers where people would leave before even I mean, fantastic jazz singers who you don't get to see very often, and people would leave the theater even before the recital was over. So there is that strong kind of ambiguity in theater. We've tried to make the theater popular. There's been a strong movement from the 1940s, 50s, 60s to make theater popular, and yet there is very little of popular element in most of the state-sponsored theater. And of course, I'm all for subsidies for theater, for creation, because that's what allows people to really go for creation, which is not always allowed in many other countries. But we still have, and I'm going through that in that first part, that very kind of conflictive relation between a claim of contemporary theater to be popular, and yet it seems very often the popular classes, if there is anything such as that, which are always kind of pushed further away from the theater, or at least the popular, the state-sponsored theater. So a very, very broad, and most of you must be knowing about that in the 1950s we have Jean Villard, who created Théâtre National Populaire. He had founded the Festival d'Avignon prior to that. We have in the 1960s the Maison de la Culture, kind of culture community center. And we have in the 60s, 70s, very important movement with Ariane Mouchkine, who created the Théâtre du Soleil, which is called a scope, participative and cooperative society. It's also sometimes referred as the cooperative of labor production. Everybody earns the same money, everybody contribute to setting the stage and absolutely everything. There is no hierarchy. A little bit later, we'll have Peter Brook, who comes in the Théâtre des Bouffes du Nord. And we have, in the 60s, also that statut d'intermittent du spectacle, which is going to evolve and allow artists to benefit from welfare schemes and to receive some subsidies as long as they perform a certain number of hours. It means it allows them, it takes into account that performing is just a small part of the job, and a lot of the work is in preparing, in writing, in rehearsing, and that's quite something unique. It's quite, I mean, it has been hard fought for, but it's there. It's always, of course, threatened. In those years of the 60s, 70s, we also have Gersig Grotowski, who had quite an impact in France as well, and you might be knowing that he came to India pretty often. There is in Shantiniketan Amarkutir some outfit of his theater over there. I went there quite a few times. You have in the 60s, again, following May 68, Dario Fo, who tries to break away from state theater structure and create its own Associazione Nueva Scena. And we are going to see, so it's really, I'm borrowing that Indian concept of inner house, outer house, here inner space, outer space. We see a lot of attempt to kind of take the theater from outside its material boundaries and take it to the people. Whether it worked or not, it's a little bit, I mean, we can wonder, but the borders are really going in the 80s to kind of really break away. We have a growing development of street theater. We have that festival, International du Théâtre de Rue in Aurillac. So there's a big opening to street art. Again, with the same kind of ambiguity, the biggest known street art troupe in France, Royal Deluxe, which started in 1979, now has become a kind of a multinational company of street art with gigantic structures strolling about streets, avenues and public spaces. But we have that, and of course that idea of breaking from the walls, breaking away from the material space of the theater, which was associated with gentrification, with conventions, existed before even in the text, in the writing of UNESCO and Samuel Beckett, but really till the 80s we see that idea of, okay, trying to reach out, reinventing the space. The book by Peter Brook, The Empty Space, in that matter is a quite, I think, quite a crucial one. I mean, I use it a lot. Or Dario Fo, that beautiful Manuale Minimo del Attore. I don't think it's translated in English, actually. It's translated in French. It's absolutely fantastic. And what is interesting in many of those attempts to create a kind of a new form of theater, a new language, that very often they are going to dig into the past. Gersig Grotowski going to study tradition of performing arts outside Europe, in this idea of reconnecting with form of art where there is not that, you know, very strong border between the stage and the audience, where the audience is supposed to be part of the performance, to reconnect it with pre-19th century form of art. Similarly, Peter Brook goes to Africa and study other forms of theater as well. You know that he stages the Mahabharata, and so it's very ambiguous. That idea of the new visual often actually is connected to an idea of reconnecting with past forms of theater, of performances. Let's call it not only theater. Now, by the 1990s and 2000, something else starts really now gaining momentum. It's really the body which becomes the site of a new visual forms. By the 1990s, hip-hop culture, choreography also has started. We broke away from modern dance, which was there with Béjar, which was the dialogue between dance and theater was there in Avignon in the 60s, but that was modern dance. We really see new forms of dance, of choreography emerging in the 90s, especially with the dance festival in Bagnolet. We see artists such as Galota, who really takes dance in totally different directions. Those are not nice bodies, those are not only young bodies. Dance also moved towards more theatric forms, or forms which are more associated with theater. This festival in Bagnolet even has a prize for humor, which is usually more associated with theater. Also because, of course, maybe for street culture, dance and body might be a slightly more egalitarian space, less vested with social codes, though of course we can discuss that, than the language, in the sense that without even the help of the codes of the spoken word, people still can give it a try to dance. And we see that emerging very strongly in the 1990s and 2000. We see, of course, the rise of body art, so theatralized form of dance, and now we are going to have more and more choreography and modern choreography, and contemporary dance, contemporary choreography, influencing the language of theater. And I must say that as someone who loves theater but who cannot bear to be bored as a spectator, I often went to see choreography more than theater when I was back to France. Of course, we also have a lot of very interesting theater experience happening. Day before, I think, Wajdi Mouawad was there. Certainly a very interesting director, actor, who was here for masterclass, one of the most innovating one, I would say. And he gave that definition of popular art as easy to enter, but very deep, difficult to get into. So maybe the medium is simple, but it can allow to move towards complex concepts. And now I'm getting in that last part of my talk, resisting the information. The body has come back as the center for the site of inscription of new languages. And in front of these new modes of consumption of performances, which increasingly goes through the channel of video and online, broadcasting, and we see the importance of the body being even more crucial. He was narrating in one of his conferences, which really caught my attention, the fact that he had that project for 5 years with 10 students from different countries. They would go to a city every year, a different city in the world. They had no agenda. They did not have to perform anything after that. It was just a being together, maybe coming back to the real sense of theater. And one thing he did is that he really banned, I do the same in my class, any making of that project, any filming of that project. The emotions, whatever visual emotions, emotions of whatever could happen among the students, had to be registered in the body of the students themselves and not offloaded to some devices, not being analyzed by professional experts, psychologists, sociologists, or anyone else. That had to be theirs. And that's really in the body that the experience had to find its cohesiveness. And he makes this point, which I totally agree with, is that there is nothing that TV, cinema, whatever visual art can represent that we cannot do in theater. The working of the visuality in human being and other senses goes far beyond whatever visual effect can impose upon the spectator, because of course the spectator cannot engage the same way with a screen or with too heavy loaded visual effect than with the emotion of the actor on stage. And really I can see that very strongly even on a daily basis while just teaching. And as he said, the less the communication, the less photo, the denser the project, the more internalized. And we really have to relearn how to watch, to remember, to repatriate in ourselves our own memory, emotion, interpretation. Not to leave to anyone else than us that capacity to define our relation to the world. And I think in this period of extremely radical change, technological change, that we can see maybe as an opportunity to re-explore the very basics. And I was asked to teach, for instance, a class on visuality, and I'm often extremely surprised by how poor is our use of the processes of visuality and memory. It's extremely rich and extremely complex. It can take us to very far, and it's not, I mean, it's embedded in, the technology is embedded in us. I do not work mainly on shipbuilding, and if you visit, for instance, so-called traditional shipbuilding yards, I don't know really what it means that they are traditional, they mean wooden ones. You wouldn't see any power supply. There's almost no instruments to measure, 5 or 6 maximum, and yet the people, the shipbuilders, can build ships which are going to cross the oceans and which really require an extreme precision. You can't mess around with building a ship, otherwise you're just dead. And so it's unoffloaded technology, it's internalized technology, and of course it's through apprenticeship. The teaching goes without words, but yet so we have maybe to rediscover that technology which is in us, and that to recreate that poetic sphere a little bit away from well, over-analyzed, over-processed devices. And I will end up with, it's not that I want to sound intellectual, but there is some few words by Deleuze which written in 1970s, which I find extremely relevant, and I made it as simple because it's very interesting. It was, of course, written before this so-called age of information, and I'm always very surprised that people, you know, seems to be so happy about living in an age of information. And information is a nervous message, and too much information can just kill us. It's nothing to be so happy about it. I mean, information is not knowledge. And Deleuze, in his conference, What is the Creative Act in 1987, defined information as a control order and wrote, the ability to create connection that sounds in the first place irrational, absurd, unreal, but which end making, sorry, that's not Deleuze, that's myself. Let's go on that. And I'll go back, yes, I'll go to the original Deleuze, sorry. What is information? Yes, let's skip that part. I think better to go directly to Mr. Deleuze. What is information? It's not very complicated. Everyone knows what it is. Information is a set of imperatives, slogans, directions, order words. When you are informed, you are told what you are supposed to believe. In other words, informing means circulating an order word. And we are really in a world of over-information and communication, where we are given order words all the time, when we are seeking for them by always watching our devices. Police declarations are appropriately called communique, and information is communicated to us. They tell us what we are supposed to be ready to, or have to, or be held to believe. And not even believe, but pretend like we believe. We are not asked to believe, but to behave as if we did. That is information, communication. And outside these orders and their transmission, there is no information, no communication. And that's quite true that there is such a narrowing of our scope of watching the world and connecting to the world around us. This is the same thing as saying that information is exactly the system of control. It is obvious, and it particularly concerns us all today. Let's say that is what information is, the controlled system of the other words used in a given society. What does the work of art have to do with it? let's not talk about works of art, but let's at least say that there is counter-information. Then he elaborates how counter-information is not always effective. Counter-information only becomes really effective when it is, and it is by nature or becomes an act of resistance. An act of resistance is not information or counter-information. Counter-information is only effective when it becomes an act of resistance. And I'm sure that maybe the language the most adapted to theater today is that idea of act of resistance, which kind of frees us from that garb of information where we are, to which we are constantly exposed. And certainly theater, so new, and I'm again always very skeptical with the idea of the new, as we see many of those attempts to go towards new forms of theater often looked back into the past and former practices of performing arts. But really, yes, it is about allowing a space and a community of people to go beyond the information. And I remember a small, and I'll conclude with that, experience when I was directing some kids for play, and we had selected short passages of UNESCO. And they would always be very skeptical in the beginning because we had almost no element. They were just there, maybe a chair, and the stage, and the spectators. And so I explained what was the idea of that kind of very absurd or imaginary kind of directing that I was proposing them to be part of. And once they would understand, they would not try to rationalize. It's doing connections which do not exist, which are just the opposite of what his information is, but to which we can all somehow identify ourselves with. And it worked just wonder. So yes, I will just finish with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. But also a brief overview of what was happening in France and brief overview of what's happening in France and the different kinds of visual languages. So thank you so much. I have been thinking ever since I was asked to come for this session that this is about visual languages, and it's about, we were told, from the point of view of the audience, from the point of view of the spectator. Now these are two different words. Audience would lead to audio and the spectator to the one who's seeing. And something which struck me was that, sort of over the last few years when the emphasis of the word kind of, the kind of, जिसको हम हिंदी में आतंक बोलते हैं, शब्द का आतंक जब खत्म हुआ, sort of the overpowering presence of the word on stage, very different kind of visual languages started emerging, and not just visual languages, but the relationship of the audience and the performer. That started transforming in different ways. Even in today's presentations, you must have noticed that how the immersive quality, the participatory quality, the quality where you become an outsider, the quality when you become an insider, the quality where you're supposed to contribute, where you're supposed to just listen. And that has led to a lot of change in the language of theatre, and that is the most fascinating part. That and the other thing I feel is that the emphasis is now not so much on communicating, but on making you experience whatever is trying to be communicated. So the experience is largely sensory, through the eyes, through the ears, through the touch, through the environment, and that once again has really transformed the theatre experience and is transforming. And not just that, the scope is just so wide. Sort of every person who is experimenting with it has this whole field of not just what kind of visual language to work with, what kind of relationship to strike with the audience, and what really to, through what kind of sense predominantly, sort of to communicate that idea. And that is what makes theatre very exciting today. One of the things that I often quote that at some stage one Polish director had come to direct a play with the students at the NSD. And as usual, you know, we have had theatre directors from East Germany, from Soviet Union, from Poland. He was also working in great depth on subtext and, you know, finding different expressions of how to communicate the subtext, which was a very new experience for the students. And we were just conversing, and I was saying that how come that in most of the East European countries, this work on subtext is just so detailed and so complex, and, you know, sort of you're trying to always evolve a language to communicate. So there is a text, and texts which are mostly we are familiar with, but what is emerging as a subtext is so complex and so different in each presentation. And, you know, so as we were conversing, he was saying that maybe, and when you put it like that, that it's only in East European countries, maybe it has to do with dictatorship, that there was just so much censorship that we were not allowed to say what we wanted to say. So the words were quite mundane and bland, but the audience came to see these performances, to participate in the sharing of the subtext. And the subtext was communicated through the visual, through the body, through the gesture, through the music, through the sound, which the censors couldn't catch. You know, sort of certainly not before the performance. So they said that this was a kind of, you know, working in depth on the subtext and finding images, finding gestures, finding music, finding sounds to express was a kind of subversive act. And that, to me, was a very fascinating idea, that how the visual language itself, or the oral language, can be the act of subversion. You know, so it can be used, it can be mobilized for that purpose. The other thing I always remember is that our Natya Shastra says that theatre is audio-visual poetry. Now, it's a very interesting formulation, that it is really privileging, or rather, let's say, emphasizing the poetry. And it is not saying that the poetry is important, the poetry in words is important, but the visual has to be poetic, the audio has to be used for poetic effect. And therefore, you know, sort of I remember in the previous session, I was saying that when you say the word, everyone imagines the same kind of mountain. I think it's the other way around. When you say a mountain, I think each one of you will have a different image of the mountain. Normally what would happen is that if you show a mountain, everyone will be seeing the same mountain. But the trick, I think, lies, a theatre artist, I mean, the challenge for the theatre artist is that how do you show the mountain that still the opportunity for 90 people to see different mountains remains. That's when you turn that visual of the mountain into poetry. When you allow the space for each one to see a different mountain, even though you are showing a mountain. So I just feel that transforming this, you know, sort of whether it's a sound image, whether it's a visual image, transforming it in a manner that it becomes open-ended, it becomes more complex, it allows for more personalized meaning-making is what really is poetry all about. And that, you know, Natya Shastra articulates it like that is something which is very beautiful. And that is why in most of our traditional forms, we see that possibility of complexity. We see that kind of open-endedness, that it can have so many meanings. If any of you have seen Kudiyattam performances, I'm sure many of you have, the kind of wonder it creates through just a small gesture, or just a small look of the eye, there are hardly any words. The thing is not privileging the word or the other, but in today's world where words are losing meaning, you know, for us, in the way they're used, I think this becomes a very significant political statement also, to have a visual language, to develop a visual language, to develop a, you know, sort of an experiential language. And I think theatre today is also competing with other forms like the internet, like the TV, and whatever other media. And therefore, the other compulsion of engaging the audience in a very different way than what these other medium can. So I think that's also transforming the nature of seeing, the nature of engaging, and the nature of the relationship between the two. I'll not take too much time so that you have the time to question our panelists. Thank you. Our panelists have been very good and stuck to time, so we have time for questions. Yeah.
The first question always takes a little time to come through. So, this is to Arno. You said that the body, when it comes into focus or into operation, inscribes itself in various ways. Does it do it autonomously, or does it bring onto the stage also some markers before the opening of the show? Because the body is not just a site of fresh inscriptions, because some inscriptions might already have been, impressed on it. How is your response?
Yes, I think you can. Thank you. Thank you for the question. So for sure, this is why I was alluding, for example, to Wittgenstein and to this thing. I could also have alluded to Deleuze, who's saying the same, even if they did not like each other. I could have said the same. So sometimes it's said, the soul is like an empty space, or it's like a white sheet of paper. I think that's not at all true. It is full. It is full of cliches. It is full of prejudgments which are already inscribed. So we have a cliche of what love is. We have a cliche, and I think this alludes to what you all said, that we have information. Yeah? And that is the one imprint which we have. And as you said, poetry starts when we start to free and undo these imprints. Therefore, what in philosophy would with Derrida call deconstruction is a part of every art. You don't have to read Derrida in order to deconstruct, because every artist will almost naturally start to deconstruct, because you are not a white paper, but first you start with fighting against how you walk, yeah? And then you come the stereotype of walking. I think this is why the talk shows are so not interesting, yeah? Where people in Europe, they are allowed to say everything. But because they do not start with deconstruction, they just repeat the cliches. So if you look in 100 channels, you will see 100 people saying almost the same, because they are no artists, because they do not start with the work of deconstructing the prejudgments which are already, and then you can have the McDonald's system. You say you have so many different McDonald's, but it's all the same. Either the McDonald's is in Delhi or in Vienna will not make a big difference. And I think, therefore, as you said, it's really the starting point of any art, to make it very general now, is deconstruction, that you start to fight against what is there, because you see that that does not bring you into the deeper sense of what you sense. Yeah? And therefore there is always a moment, at least, of deconstruction in the
मैडम नमस्कार, गुड इवनिंग। मेरा एक क्वेश्चन है कि आपसे ही है, इफ़ यू आर डूइंग कास्टिंग, सो व्हाट इज़ द मेजर डिफरेंस बिटवीन फिल्म कास्टिंग और एंड प्ले कास्टिंग? मेजर डिफरेंस एंड मेजर चैलेंज.
How will you link it to this session?
Okay, as you मुझे लगा कि आप प्रोफेसर हैं तो बहुत अच्छा
हाँ, नहीं, प्रोफेसर हैं तो बाद में बात करें इसके बारे में, but let's stick to the topic.
No problem.
And if you can connect it to this topic, then.
पर मुझे लगा कि आपने दोनों फील्ड में ही अपनी महारत.
But that's a separate.
Okay, no problem.
Hello, I'm a visual artist, and I don't really have a question, but I have an interesting link and connection with something that Arno said about this idea of these images that you shared. I was, like, the moment it was projected initially, even before the talk started, I was quite engrossed with it, because there is an experience of me working with the notebooks. And in my university, during this 2-year master's course, this is what exactly happened with me, which was something to do with the text and the writing, taking notes in the class. So the class becoming the professor becoming this performer for me, and I was in that process trying to take down notes. And but then what happened is that, you know, it started to get layered, as you know. So initially I would just write the text, whatever I could hear, and whatever I couldn't process, I just put it down. But then gradually, there were more drawings, more lines, more, you know, so certain kind of, and the whole text became like, you know, overlapping each other, and, you know, it just became something very crazy happening. Because, so when and that notebook is a 2-year, you know, during that 2 years I used it. And when I see it now, it's a very interesting, you know, artwork itself for me. It's an art piece, because it kind of shows me that how, and it has so many layers. So it's not just like, you know, I'm sitting here, I'm trying to document something, but it comes with all kind of emotional, you know, realms that you are in. You are not understanding something, or you're thinking of something outside, or you want to really rush, or you want to just sleep maybe, I don't know, like, you know. So there are a lot of, so this whole, the idea of subjectivity itself has some kind of a, you know, of course it's not private in that sense, of course one is completely into that kind of conversation. And it was such an interesting point when you actually mentioned this artist. I would also like to know his name again, because I missed, but it's a very, something very evocative for me as well. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Want to say something?
Yeah, please do talk about it if you want.
Also his name is Nikolaus Ganster. I can give you the name.
Sure.
I like him a lot. You have to think, or to put it also back to the NSD, because most of the people here are not visual artists like you, but you said it beautifully, that students usually automatically do they sense and start to do a kind of decorations if they are no artists, but they will start to paint probably when it's boring or whatever. So you should not look into the books when you have students, how much they did paint, because probably it was boring. So that is one thing. But to bring it back to NSD also, I would have had a second video, but I thought then it's too much. You will see that he is doing this also on the stage, for example, with artists. So he has developed really from this, what you said, very primordial experience even most of us will have as a student. He developed it really as an art form, and he is doing this often on stage. So there is a performance going on, and you will see somewhere a video where he is live here, and he has a camera on a table, and on the table there will be colors and objects. And you see what he's always doing during the performance in order as one voice of the person give you a visual impression of what is going on right now on the stage. And therefore he becomes a kind of visual command of the performing arts as part of a performing art.
Yeah.
Just to try to connect it with theater or with actors, the drawing. My students I mentioned close reading, and it could also be, and they do this, they create books so that the map, you could call it a map or a web, what is opening up in one line of the text. So the hidden text behind the text is visualized as a map guarding them, so that they know this is what I meant. This is very important, first of all, that students not only learn by heart, but they know what is all the complexity of the being together from the, not only from the ensemble, but also from the characters. And so there are, this just to mention it, that there is a connection to the fine arts, I think.
My name is Amitesh. I work in performance. My question is to Dr. Arno and Arnika, both of you. Thank you for talking about ways in which knowledge, philosophy, and performance interact with each other. The question that I want to ask is specific to performance and does not include other art, like visual art. Visual art, for example, has had a growing relationship with philosophy. Many artists, when they work today, read philosophy and also find it productive for their art practice. I'm noticing that performance has had a certain philosophical turn in the last few years. With reference to, for example, I'm referring Laura Cull's performance philosophy as a growing field of knowledge around performance and philosophy. Now, historically, we know that philosophy has had a disdain for performance, in the sense that philosophers have hated coming to the theater. That in a sense that they have found theater twice removed from the idealist state of thinking about the world. In the modern times, we also experienced theater as becoming illustrative of philosophy itself, almost as if theater is the sensual part of philosophy. I heard both of you say that when you think about performance, or when Arnika was talking about Mobile Academy, that research that had already been done was brought into formats of performance and theater, almost as if performance and philosophy is a one-way street. That theater and performance becomes the application of knowledge that is already out there, and is brought into certain kind of arrangement and formats for audience to experience. And this is where my question is. Can performance itself be a site of thinking? And can it confront, add, or subvert other forms of knowledge that are being produced outside of it?
Yeah, I agree with you, and can just answer with yes. And at the same time, when I think about the Mobile Academy and the way they work and the way questions are asked and the way knowledge, research on facts enter the space of fabulation, of imagining something. You need some crazy people who can dare to do this and who are willing to take that on a stage. And I think in our experience, there were a couple of philosophers who are willing to do this, you know, but then at the same time, we don't mainly work with philosophers. They're just one group of people who come and be part of this.
Yeah, I know Laura very well. So we are working together since the very beginning of performance philosophy. The last performance philosophy journal issue was edited by us in Vienna, so from our group in a peak project. So I'm very aware of the problems which you see. So I think it would be very bad if performance becomes an illustration of philosophy, yeah? And it would be very bad if philosophy would become performance. That is not the question for me, yeah? But what you said much more, and Nicholas for me is a good example, that, you know, it's about, so our title was Event and Immanence, yeah, the Deleuzian concept of immanence. So it is not about you are bringing concepts into the performance, but it is about, this is why I brought in the word sensing and touching, it's about, can you create, this is now my terms of philosophy on stage, can you create sensible milieus in any situation? This does not have to be a theater for sure, it can be all rooms. Can you create sensible milieus which allow the emergence of new configurations which you cannot anticipate? So it's all about not bringing concepts into the performance, but creating milieus in which something can emerge which probably counters or resist or whatever. So that is the Laura Kahl thing. You probably, I could speak very long now on this issue. Only one thing. What you said about philosophy, that's true. If you know Aristotle, he exactly says you don't have to, only the I always think only stupid people go into the theater because they would prefer to know the text. Yeah? So this is a long tradition we are fighting against. Plato himself, we said it already, he destroyed his artworks in order to become a Socratic philosopher. So in Europe there is really a big struggle since long ago. But what is about Diogenes? He was a performer, living in a box, living together with dogs in a box like a punk. Yeah? And so there are very many traditions, even in Europe, where you can see that philosophers were performers themselves. But you are right, not Aristotle and not Plato, the two big names of European philosophy.
I just want to, I wanted to intervene, that I felt that her presentation kind of gave that, potential. I don't know what the project actually turned out as, but the very questions that she read out about what they were trying to explore about our understanding of depth, of that death or that realm near death, it seemed that then theatre would be the site where the thinking about those ideas would happen. And it would be maybe a multiple disciplinary engagement which might lead to that, or it could be any individual's engagement with that idea. So I think in that kind of project it does become the site for actually exploring those ideas.
Yes, I mean, it's I think a very interesting point you made, but if we start from this very basic point of view that we don't know the word, we only have imagination of the word, imaginary representation, we just have very biased view of whatever is around us. And the theater is certainly the site where can emerge different imaginaries and certainly influence far beyond only the performing moment. And I guess that's why many of those big names of theaters, Getowski, Peter Brook, and all that, went to different, parts of the world where maybe this conflict between the world of ideas and the theater didn't carry that legacy. And listening to Wadi Mohawad again, which is very interesting because he performs, he directs in Quebec and in France, but coming from a background of someone who is in exile from Lebanon and who have experimented war in his childhood, he said that he's interested in bringing, not in enacting all epics of folk stories, but the epics of today. And he brings back different dimensions which often have been downplayed in Western theater, which is, for instance, violence, which he has experimented. And also the collapse of different geographical spaces and time sequences. He had that line that the actor can let resurface through the written word for him. So something different can emerge. And I'm pretty sure personally that, yes, I mean, it's maybe a misconception to look at performing arts, not only theater, but body art and many forms. There's been a collapse of many art practices now, only as the illustration of mode of thoughts which have been made up there somewhere else in the academia or among intellectuals.
Okay, so now the time is running out. Last 2 questions.
Good evening. It's all right. I think my voice will carry on.
Hello.
My name is Amit Dahiya Badshah. I'm a working poet for the last 25 years. And I think that theatre, and especially the visual language of theatre, has performed 4 acts of disservice without intending it. For one thing, the Indian politician has learned very badly from Indian theatre and has become a very dangerous performer. Then the street beggar has become a very, very sophisticated thief on the road. Again, bringing very, very dramatic skills to the art of begging. And then we have the guru, the mendicant, the misleader of millions of people. And finally, bad poets who have brought to performance poetry a huge celebration of one word, just the fuck word. And it's a shame, because I think all of them think that theatre is about verbosity. It's about the litany of words, not the space between words, which seems to be vanishing from our theatre, but the words themselves, the quantum of words, the quantity of words. And the result is we have some of the worst politics, some of the most intrusive begging. We have some of the most misleading gurus in the world. And I'm ashamed to say some really, really bad.
So I suppose words. Visual language is what we need to develop, which is what we do about it.
As an antidote rather than as an embellishment.
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. Thank you for the stimulating talk. I mean, because of all the names that were thrown out, right from Kant, Plato, Aristotle, and all. So I was also, I mean, like Deleuze brought to my mind Henry Bergson and all. So I was thinking about all, I mean, a lot of theories were going on in my mind, Marshall McLuhan's Medium is the Message, and Derrida's Archive Fever, and all those things were making me think about a lot of things, especially when you think about new visual language in theatre. So often what happens is, every language, linguistics and the semiotics of it all, once we trace. So as ma'am mentioned, that when somebody says the word mountain, everybody imagines his or her own mountain. When one shows the mountain, that's when that is the mountain that you're supposed to see. So in those domains, as sir mentioned the word fuck. So if we go into the symbology of it all, so this symbol is the most profound symbol, so to speak. So this symbol is a symbol that profounds it or passes it on. But then again, at the same point of time, once one takes into account Jacques Rancière's The Emancipated Spectator, one realizes that the meaning of a thing is not just what I as a speaker intended to be, the meaning is also what the listener is taking it to be. It's not just one-sided, there is not just one meaning. So in all of these, so there have been cases wherein certain kinds of provocative performances, if one may say, have gone to different parts of the world, and they have not had the same reaction or result in the people who are the audiences. So in these areas, when it comes down to, so there is no one specific meaning, there is no one specific philosophy, there is no one specific meaning of the language. So a language which has been 1,000-year old, if it has not been seen by me or the people who are in this audience, in the audience or amongst the spectators, for them, that old language is also a new language. So there is always this, old is also new, and new is also perhaps elaboration of whatever has been or an extension of it all. So especially because I really like Derrida and his idea of deconstruction and all, because it makes one question the meaning-making process of everything. And theatre has a lot to do with meaning and metaphors. So how do you think it all relates? And I am myself a lot jumbled up in my head because of all the names that are coming up, and I'm contemplating a lot of things. Kant makes me think of Bohler and all those things. So how do you relate all these ideas, if you can somehow, if I'm making some sense of coherence in my articulation? I know I'm just going a little here and there, but these ideas of philosophy of body and meaning, body makes me think about Kudiyattam, wherein there have been instances wherein an actor has to lift a mountain, but the actor in his own imagination has thought that the mountain is so heavy that he cannot lift it up. And then Arto's idea that
we give time to them to answer.
I'm sorry.
Anybody would like to answer?
Yeah, so for me there are several levels which we should think. So one, if I go to Derrida, then another term which he uses, which by the way he quotes Sanskrit when using this term. It's the only, as far as I know, the only moment where Derrida comes. It's iteration, itara. So, which can mean the other, but also repetition. Yeah? So, for me, what you were saying, this is culminating in this word iteration, because I don't think it's a prejudgment that we have only the stereotypes in language. There I would protect language. When it's poetic, you don't have the stereotypes. We should not draw language against the sensual or something, because language can be very sensual in a certain way. It can be very touching in that way. And stereotypes, iterations, are not only in language, as Wittgenstein, in the usage of the meaning, which we have inherited from a tradition, but the same in the way how I walk. Or for example, culturally where my voice sits. In many countries, for example, women have a very high voice, not because the body, that is their natural way, but they are culturally trained in a certain way to think. So it's not, the cliche is not only in the language, it's also in the body. And I think that's a problem of any practitioner on the stage, that there again, how can you walk so that it's not just repeating the cliche of walking. So I think we should not have it in the layer only there is the bad language which has the cliches, and then there is the good body which frees you from the cliché. It can be the other way around also, because iteration takes place on both levels. You can understand me only because I now speak in English, probably. Or some of you can understand me. But have I, as Arno, created the English language? I can, as a person, only speak in English because I always now quote the English language. So in a certain way, it's me who is speaking here, but I can only speak personally while quoting the tradition of the English language. So it's always both. On one side, I can try now to speak personally to you, but I can do that only on the basis that I quote a cultural plexus of speaking, which some of us here know, and therefore we can more or less understand the classical use of the words, which I am using right now. So it's a play always, again, not against the one and the other, but it's a play in between. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think with that we wind up. Thank you very much for sitting patiently. Thank you to the panelists for the wonderful presentations. Thank you.
Thank you all for this wonderful session. We are grateful to you for sparing your time and sharing your ideas with us so wholeheartedly. The last 2 days have been abundant with intellectual exchanges, debates, and a lot of food for thought for all of us, especially since we looked at so many different perspectives to decipher the position of visual language in theatre. Thank you all for being with us and being so involved in this exchange of ideas. Also, kindly make a note